Thank you for bearing with me. It's been 6 years since I was last here. Last presented here in 2018. It's nice to be back. This is a special one for me because actually my son is here. And I won't point him out because I don't want to embarrass him. It's not Rupert. But no, it means a lot to me that he can be here to see me speak for the first time. A lot has changed since the last time I was here, including my disclosures, which I'll get to in just a moment. I did change the title of my presentation just slightly from what's in your program. So I'll be talking about the implementation of emerging psychedelics, access considerations for a potential new paradigm of care. And these are my disclosures. All right. So I'm going to run through this pretty quickly because I think this is an audience that's probably fairly familiar with what's already on this slide. I'm going to be speaking about psychedelics, and I'm going to use that term in the broadest context. Certainly many would define that term differently, both in terms of the literal definition, but also as far as what compounds we would include as psychedelics. But for the purposes of this talk, I'm talking about classical psychedelics, which are those that have their effect primarily mediated at the 5-HT2A receptor. The classical psychedelics like psilocybin, LSD, DMT, et cetera, but also including compounds like MDMA and ketamine. And suffice it to say that at sufficient dosages, psychedelics induce certain acute changes in perception that may be quite meaningful. They can have high interpersonal meaning. And that also non-pharmacologic factors, sometimes referred to as set and setting, mindset and setting, may play an important role in those subjective effects. And plants and fungi with psychedelic properties, as well as synthetic psychedelics, have been used by indigenous groups and others for hundreds, if not thousands of years, oftentimes in either ritualistic or ceremonial contexts, or perhaps just screwing around. I assume people have done that forever as well. But it's only been more recently that the use within medical contexts has been explored for the treatment of diagnosed illnesses. And this graph shows the progression of that. You can see that there was the pre-prohibition era between 1950 and 1970, where about 40,000 people were involved as subjects in studies of psychedelic compounds. Then in 1970 and 1971, with the Controlled Substances Act and the Narcotics Act, these were placed on Schedule I and deemed illegal with no approved medical use, and because of the perception that there was high probability of abuse or misuse. So that led to a quiet period where any research was really happening more underground, or just underground use outside of research contexts, until we get into the noughties and the 2010s, where there's been this resurgence. And that has been largely in fairly small open label studies, academic studies at places like Imperial College London, not too far from here, Johns Hopkins, UCLA, small pilot studies, oftentimes in groups with terminal illness or existential distress, perhaps with a mood disorder or an anxiety disorder as well. But we fast forward to today, and this is quite an active area of research at this point. In fact, the majority of investigation on new drug applications to FDA are for psychedelic studies, which is quite remarkable. Just with a brief search of clinicaltrials.gov recently, I did this, I guess about a month ago now, there were 73 active studies that met the criteria I've listed there on the left, and that was for a range of indications, the majority mood disorders like MDD or TRD, bipolar depression, but also many in substance use disorders, post-traumatic stress disorder, eating disorder, and OCD and others. What's notable about most of these studies and most of the investigation of psychedelic treatments right now is that we're not just investigating the effect of a drug or a drug alone, but it's typically paired with some model of support or psychotherapy. And so this touches on a number of the talks we've just heard over the past couple of hours. Notably, FDA came out with draft guidance just back in June for manufacturers for psychedelic treatments to give some guidance on how these studies can be conducted, given that this is quite different than what we're used to, and especially with the investigation of drugs like SSRIs, given that these are administered in medical settings typically. They're not likely going to be drugs taken orally at home. But there's also significant potential for unblinding or unmasking of the active treatment, expectancy effects, et cetera, and also considerations of patient safety. And there's a wide continuum of how these drugs are being investigated. On one side of that continuum, we can look at Lykos, formerly MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, that is explicitly calling their model of support psychotherapy, with MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. And they've recently submitted their NDA for FDA review. Their hypothesis is that the drug is catalyzing a process of psychotherapy. On the other end of that spectrum, another company, MindMed, recently reported some phase 2b results of LSD in generalized anxiety disorder, and are very explicit, they're very clear that they have not only psychotherapy, but not any model of psychological support. They really have a quite minimal model. And in between there, other examples are ones like Compass Pathways, which uses a model of psychological support that primarily focuses on patient safety, both physical and psychological safety, includes elements of preparation that are primarily psychoeducation and the building of rapport with patients prior to administration. The administration sessions, the model varies widely again from that MDMA-assisted therapy, which can be quite active, given the nature of MDMA being a more relational one, as opposed to the classical psychedelics, which tend to be quieter and more internal experiences, therefore less interactive. And then typically there's some form of integration that follows that gives patients the opportunity to relate their experience back to the therapist or whatever the designation may be for the person who's been attending this treatment with them. This talk is going to focus primarily on the US. I realize there's a bit of a tendency from anyone from the US to be quite US-centric. The reality is that for most manufacturers, the US will likely be the first market and potentially the largest market. That has more to do with payer considerations than regulatory. It's just very difficult in single-payer environments in the UK and Europe to meet the thresholds for HTA bodies to demonstrate the cost-effectiveness or the comparative effectiveness. And so while hopefully these will be treatments available in Europe as well, I will be focusing primarily for this talk again on the US. Some of you may be aware that along with all of the hype around psychedelics right now, it's not only medical models through FDA pathways that are being explored, but there's also a tremendous amount of activity at the state level through essentially either parallel regulatory models or more commonly decriminalization or legalization efforts that are more aimed at wellness than necessarily the treatment of illness. They vary widely. They are also not models that are likely ever to be reimbursed by insurance, so these are out-of-pocket payment, and they are, at least at this point, in conflict with federal law, as opposed to FDA-approved medicines which have met certain standards of safety, efficacy, and the quality of the drug, manufactured to GMP standards. If approved, FDA-approved products typically are paid for by commercial and government insurers and then prescribed by licensed healthcare providers in healthcare settings. For this talk, I am going to focus on the column on the left, FDA-approved medicines. That's, not by way of saying that there's not potential benefit or a role of the column on the right, but my focus will be FDA-approved medicines. So what does this really mean? What is FDA approval? I'm going to read this verbatim here. The FDA is responsible for protecting the public health by assuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biological products, medical devices, U.S. food supply, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation. Drugs are evaluated for safety, efficacy, and quality. And just focusing on that third element for a moment, of course, many psychedelics are available as derived from natural sources, plants and fungi. It's pretty difficult, though, to ensure the reproducibility, the quality, the standardization of doses across natural products. And so most of the drugs that you'll be seeing tested right now in regulatory trials are synthetic products. Also important to note, and again, very much addressed by that recent FDA draft guidance, the FDA does not regulate psychotherapy or medical practice. So just to summarize that guidance that I've been referring to, this was released last June. They outline considerations for trial conduct, data collection, and subject safety, cover studies on both classical psychedelics as well as entactogens or pathogens like MDMA. And it aims to help researchers design studies that will yield interpretable results that may be capable of supporting future drug applications. One thing that's quite important that they make explicit in this guidance is that the same standards are going to apply to psychedelic treatments as to any other application for review. Psychedelics, even though they're groovy, don't get any kind of a free pass. Let's see, how's this pointer work? You see it. There's that picture on the right, looks pretty confusing, right? That represents the very Byzantine US healthcare system. There is absolutely no way that in this very short time I have to talk, I'm going to be able to scratch the surface to describe the structure of the US healthcare system to you. But that said, healthcare in the US is typically delivered by licensed healthcare providers in licensed settings, paid for by a range of insurance products that can be either commercial or government insurance. As screwy as our system is, and it really is, it's almost like somebody tried to make it as expensive and complicated as possible. The fact is that 92% of people are covered by some form of health insurance, and most do rely upon that to accept, access, and afford care. Patients typically do have some contribution to the cost of their care in the form of deductibles, copays, or coinsurance. And there are many, many insurance product types that, again, I'm not going to have the time to get into right now, but also different structures of how care is paid for, from the most common these days, which is fee-for-service. Essentially, a treatment is delivered and a prescriber or provider is compensated for that. But then there's also, particularly in government payment structures, things like prospective payment, which fall outside of fee-for-service, and value-based contracting, which is becoming a bit more common. And that contracting can happen either between manufacturers and the payer, or between providers and payers. But it's a structure that is intended to incentivize value instead of just how much care you can provide. So, some of the important implications for broad and equitable patient access with FDA-approved products is that in some cases, government payers are actually required to pay for it. There's a concept called the 6 protected classes from CMS that is continually under fire, but for now is still in place. These are 6 classes of drugs that must be covered by US government payers, and antidepressants are one of them. It is also important to note that because these drugs are currently Schedule 1, they will need to be rescheduled after approval before it's legal for physicians to prescribe them. That is also quite a complex process that's probably beyond the scope of this talk. But something that people often don't realize is that it needs to be rescheduled at 2 levels. The first is at the federal level, and post-FDA approval, it moves to DEA, who have 90 days to make a rescheduling determination, because at that point, technically, Schedule 1 doesn't apply, because Schedule 1 is no approved medical use. If there's now an approved medical use, it needs to be rescheduled. However, it's not done there. It then needs to move to the states, and every one of the 50 states also needs to reschedule the drug. About half of states have so-called trigger laws, where they essentially follow federal guidance. The other states, it's a bit more active and requires some administrative or legislative action. But at that point, it's legal for physicians to prescribe. Moving on. That means, though, that there still are a number of unanswered questions that will need to be resolved prior to the potential approval and potential commercialization of these products. Number one, most likely all of these drugs will have a REMS. Now, that is one way that you can enumerate the elements to assure safe use, which is ATASU is the term that's usually applied to a REMS. It goes layers deeper than your approved label, your prescribing instructions. But then the manufacturer can also set certain requirements for safe use and not ship drug unless they're met. And so some questions within all of this is, what will be stated in the label? Most likely these labels will be fairly broad, again, because FDA does not regulate psychotherapy or medical practice. So you can expect that you'll probably see broad labels that say something like, X product is indicated for Y indication and should be administered with psychological support. But it's then likely that a REMS will go a bit further, and depending upon the manufacturer and product, may stipulate what the credentialing of a healthcare provider may look like, what the level of training is that's required, whether there'll be specific requirements for training in the model that they've used to support patients during the trials, or whether they'll be more agnostic about that. Also, will there be specifications for where care may be delivered? If there's a REMS, then certainly it's going to need to be delivered in a REMS-certified center. But what may some of the other infrastructure requirements be, and who will be prepared to deliver that? And given all of these things as potential barriers to access, what about historically underserved populations and those that live in more rural areas and potentially do not have access within some reasonable distance to care? So just taking a deeper dive into this notion of therapist training, and again, acknowledging that there is a wide continuum of what they may be trained in, whether that's psychotherapy, psychological support, or something that's perhaps more minimal than that. There's the consideration that in the coming years, there might be multiple approvals for products that do have differences in their models of support for different drugs, for different indications, or across different manufacturers. So right off the bat, there's the consideration, might therapists need to be trained in multiple of these different models? That potentially puts a tremendous amount of burden upon therapists. So we may need to look at some existing precedents for educational curricula and postgraduate training, also recognizing that depending upon what type of clinician we're talking about, if it's physicians, changing physician curricula through the academy is quite difficult. They don't love to make changes to that. And then if you look at other types of providers like social workers, licensed clinical social workers, that curriculum is not necessarily standardized across all educational programs. I also mentioned sites of care. In the US, there are many, many, many different types of sites of mental health care delivery, and we can bucket them according to different phenotypes. And some are likely to be much more ready sooner to deliver a complex treatment like a psychedelic treatment than others. Each have different considerations of their physical infrastructure, their workforce, whether they are contracted with commercial and/or government payers, the administrative or operational capabilities they have to comply with something like a REMS, to procure, store, safely handle a controlled substance, et cetera. But some that exist already currently deliver analogous treatments, such as esketamine, and are relatively ready for these approvals. Since we're at the ketamine and related compounds conference, probably worth mentioning ketamine and what we can learn from the ketamine and esketamine story. Something I remember quite well hearing back in 27, 18, 19, 20, is that nobody's ever going to prescribe Spravato because ketamine is available and it's cheap and we know it works and so on and so forth. And a lot of people were standing up ketamine clinics and thought that was going to be a great business, that was going to scale. They were largely run by non-psychiatrists, et cetera. And fast forward to 2024, and ketamine is well on its way to blockbuster status. And we've seen the proliferation of the infrastructure of interventional psychiatry clinics that typically deliver a broad range of services that include esketamine, sometimes alongside of ketamine, usually with TMS, sometimes with general psychiatry services and psychotherapy as well. And they are flourishing and scaling. And we see the closures and the failure of lots of pure play ketamine clinics. Some of them have been quite well known in public just over the past couple of years, like Field Trip and Ketamine Wellness Centers. I think it's been quite well established that operationalizing a treatment like ketamine is actually fairly easy if you're a healthcare operator. The tougher stuff and where delivery really needs to build muscle is delivering real U.S. healthcare. It's doing things like having revenue cycle management and all the operational administrative complexities that go into complying with things like REMS and so forth that the ketamine clinics are not as well set up to manage. So some other notes to take from at least some of the early challenges, though, with the esketamine rollout were some of the things with coding and reimbursement. And fortunately, that's been prepared for now with psychedelics with a recently approved application for new Category 3 CPT codes that address the gap in the code set for the support of patients during administration. Now, as I mentioned, a lot of the delivery infrastructure over the past 4 years, largely because of the presence of esketamine, is starting to be built in the form of interventional psychiatry clinics, but also hospital systems, integrated health systems, integrated delivery networks, et cetera, that are very good at delivering complex treatments. I'm sure I'm running low on time, although I don't have a clock. I think I just have a few more slides here. Some of these things I think I've already mentioned. Across the existing infrastructure, a lot of the rooms that exist now are already fairly well prepared. I would say if you were to look at an existing esketamine room or ketamine room, it looks a lot like what will be required to deliver psychedelic treatments. They're appropriately sized. They're typically comfortably appointed. And so I think different than perhaps some of the perception out there that people will need to spend a lot of money and install lots of equipment in order to deliver psychedelic treatments. Many sites are probably more prepared than they may realize. I mentioned the CPT codes. A key challenge to workforce constraints and provider-level financial viability will be this fact that the administration days across these products tend to be fairly long. There are some shorter-acting compounds in development as well, but the most advanced of them, those that are currently in phase 3 or later phase 2, do have fairly long administration days that do require the presence in the room the whole time of one or more healthcare providers. In the case of Lykos' product, it's 2. There are many questions that will be answered within the context of these regulatory trials for approval. There will be additional questions that won't get answered within these trials, but are really important opportunities, I think, potentially post-approval. To meet FDA requirements, you need to demonstrate safety and efficacy. But most trials are using minimal models that are focused on safety, minimal support models. Why? Not necessarily because they're the most effective ways to support patients having these treatments, but because the requirement is to demonstrate the effect of the drug. And one of the ways that you can be sure that you're demonstrating a drug effect is to minimize some of the other factors, like a psychotherapy that might cloud that picture. But that will leave questions remaining about the potential synergies of other psychological treatments, even though they also will require additional resources to deliver them. And so of course, there's always going to be, some balance between, cost of care and access for patients and needing to minimize the cost of treatment in order to reach the most patients that may benefit. But again, there may be opportunities that need to be explored, potentially post-approval to see if there may be ways to augment the effects of these treatments with either specific or non-specific effects. So in conclusion, these treatments have shown a great deal of promise for a range of psychiatric conditions. Probably the thing we need to guard against most right now is the hype around these treatments, because of course they're not going to work for every patient. There are risks that we need to pay attention to, and this is something that still needs to be approached with the same deal of equipoise and rigor as anything else that we investigate. And they represent a potentially new paradigm of care that comes with incumbent challenges because it's a new paradigm of care. The uptake of interventional psychiatry treatments has helped to spur the building of the necessary infrastructure that may be required to deliver them, but questions remain about challenges to scale to address what we know are still tremendous unmet needs. So thank you, and I'll take questions.
Thanks very much, Steve. A lot to think about there. Any questions?
Here.
Do you have any thoughts about post-approval, how patient education and preparation materials might have to change? If there's different expectations or awareness of...
Yeah, just in case everybody didn't hear it, the question was around post-approval. Any thoughts about how patient education, the materials and the method, if that's right, may need to change? For trials, of course, it needs to be highly, highly standardized, right? And so the way, it's kind of like school when you're growing up. The class may not be taught in the way that's most effective for every student. You need to generalize it in a way that works for the most people. And so, of course, this varies right now across manufacturers, but some are using apps as a way to supplement the face-to-face contact with therapists to provide psychoeducation and prepare patients. But I anticipate that in a post-approval world, there will be, number one, more latitude for settings and providers to choose the way that they prepare patients, as long as they meet the required elements of preparation, and that reflective of patients' different learning styles and needs, this may need to come through multimedia, multimodal ways that match patients' needs, especially reflective of the fact that with many of these conditions, patients are somewhat cognitive impaired by the time they're entering treatment.
It's not clear to me if you understand psychedelics, whatever, any kind of psychedelics you're thinking of, as a product, as a pill, as a something, or as a treatment. It's conceptual difference, and it makes escalation different. It makes the barriers to entrance different. So how do you understand, as a product, as a pill that I give to people, or as a treatment that it's more complicated to give?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think that, that varies a lot. That approach varies a lot across different manufacturers right now. There are those who, I think, in a nod to some of the criticisms of the potential cost of these treatments, that are presenting this as a pill, right? Just as a medication outside of a context. Whereas, again, on the other end of the spectrum, you can look at Lykos's program, which is, clearly framed as a psychedelic-assisted therapy, and some in between that are considering this still maybe a treatment more than a medicine, reflective of this being a different paradigm of care that does require more support because of the unique features.
Looking to the ketamine clinics, I can see that those who treated this as a product were not succeeded in the business. Those who see this as a treatment were more successful in the clinic.
I don't know about that. I think
On ketamine clinics around the U.S., I can. I don't have data. I just have my perception and years of experience, and I don't. Okay, you have data to show me that's not accurate. We don't. We're just speculating.
discuss that one over a beer in a few minutes. Yeah. Jerry, you had a question?
I mean, the big question for me is, how are you going to define healthcare providers? The studies they're being designed fairly specifically. Is this going to be a nurse? Is it going to be, what is the licensure? Because I think that's what the FDA can work with.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Jerry's question, for those that didn't hear it, was how are you going to define healthcare provider? What are going to be the credentials of those who are supporting patients or conducting therapy with them in the context of these treatments? I think, looking at the FDA's draft guidance, it seems like one element that's most important to them is that this be somebody who has a license, something on the line that they stand to lose to guard against misbehavior. Over the course of time, and I'll focus on maybe the evolution for Compass, since that's the one I know best. The paradigm started off in phase 2 with 2 therapists in the room, and one of them was either an MD or a PhD. And then that moved down to one of them being at least a master's level therapist, somebody within the scope of their licensure could independently provide psychotherapy, and that's still the case for Compass within phase 3. But there's arguments to be made that, particularly with a classical psychedelic, where largely the instruction, and I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek here, but for the day of administration, it comes down to 4 words: be cool, do less. A lot of the training of therapists for that administration day is to actually unlearn a lot of the more active intervention that they might do. In which case, your unflappable nursing workforce might be very well suited and might be, really a way of broadening the workforce and making this more cost effective. So these are some decisions that are going to need to be made either in the context of proposed REMS or by manufacturers for the sale of their drug. And I think each are going to make different choices.
Come on, holding space is a top skill of a psychotherapist. Period.
I think you just say stop making interpretations.
Yeah, but also to be fair, right? There also might be a difference between the person who sits in the room during an administration day and those who are doing preparation or integration or psychotherapy around this. Yeah.
Yes.
First of all, hello. I want to say that was such a great talk, Daddy. I really I thought that was. Now I know what you do at work. And you look so young to be my dad. But no, seriously, Steve, that was, I think, very enlightening. And before I ask my question, I wanted to say that important to point out that actually in some of the Compass studies now, like the 104 study, we have just a single therapist in the room. So that's it's definitely moving towards sort of less of a burdened kind of treatment. But I wondered what you thought. I mean, it seems like we're going on 2 parallel tracks with psychedelics. We've got the FDA pathway that Compass and MindMed and Cybin are all pursuing that I think you focused on. And then you've got the Oregon model, which I can only imagine is going to appear in more and more states where they've not just decriminalized it, but they're legalizing it, licensing. Technically, they're still illegal from a federal point of view, but people are able to access it. How do you think, what's going to happen? Is there one going to win out? I'm just curious to know what you think the landscape's going to be.
Yeah, great question, David. Thank you. I can just only speculate, of course, but my guess is that these are going to continue as parallel tracks with different options for different people. There's some risks that are being uncovered, with the Oregon model, such as, it really was as designed, not intended to treat people with diagnosed mental illness, and it does not include licensed healthcare providers in the administration. These are facilitators. But a lot of the language that is being used by these sites is the language of treating illness. So it's been talking out of both sides of their mouth. Certainly it's unaffordable for a lot of people, with the cost often being in the thousands of dollars. So that's going to be out of reach for lots of folks. Then again, there are many who are mistrustful of the healthcare system or just don't want to see doctors, or whatever the scenario may be. And it may be that there are parallel options for those who perhaps do not have severe illness, et cetera. But I think the train has left the station. Obviously, this is happening. So I don't think that's going to stop. I just, I hope that along the way, we don't see patients harmed and things get derailed again.
I'm from Australia, where we're the first country to have opened the doors to regulated use of psilocybin for TRD and MDMA for PTSD. So we're actually grappling with these issues as we are setting up clinics. Like, I'm in the process of setting up a psilocybin for TRD clinic. And one of the problems with, there's a huge expense with having two people sitting in the room for the 8 hours for every dose plus all the other sessions. And we're grappling with, who should these people be? But one of the issues about having, say, mainly nurses sitting in the room while you've got all your very skilled therapists in the, integration and preparation sessions is that school of thought that you need to have been there to interact with the person and see what is going on in order to do the therapy afterwards, even if you're not doing a lot of therapy during the 8 hours of dosing. Wonder whether you have thoughts on that from your campus experience.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I'll answer actually not from my Compass experience because I don't have it from there, but maybe more as just an interventional psychiatry healthcare operator. A scenario that I could envision, which matches a lot of the existing infrastructure at this point, is multiple rooms within a center that may be delivering multiple different treatments simultaneously: ketamine, esketamine, psilocybin, MDMA, et cetera. With perhaps a nurse in the room, but a ratio of therapists who have participated in their preparation and integration, who are on site, who are available if needed. And so that way there is that continuity through the treatment. And, groups may be a consideration as well. This gets brought up a lot. I was just discussing this, I think, with Tatiana earlier. One of the challenges in our fun U.S. healthcare system is that the rules are not always equally applied from psychiatry through other specialties. And so if you look at analogous situations like in oncology, where there can be a lot of patient education that happens prior to chemotherapy, clinicians and sites are reimbursed at the same level, whether that happens as part of a group or individually. But the precedent for psychotherapy is that the reimbursement for group psychotherapy is pennies on the dollar relative to one-on-one. And then you add in the operational complexity of running a group. Maybe a little bit easier if it's virtual as opposed to a live group, but still. And so, yes, but because of the payment structure, the economies of scale may not actually be there. But you're absolutely right, and it's something that is being investigated both in healthy volunteer studies as well as RCTs right now with psychedelics.
That's a fantastic presentation, Steve. I have a question with regards to kind of using Spravato as the model, where we've seen that it's primarily psychiatrists that have adopted it. And so just curious your thoughts on, what we might see with these newer treatments.
Whether it would be primarily psychiatrists?
Right. Obviously, from the insurance side, I think there's been, questions on PAs, for example, that say, is a psychiatrist, overseeing the care sort of this patient, but is that kind of the thought process with these newer treatments, or any thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sangya, and it touches on something I was, just briefly alluded to earlier, which is that the regulator could be at a few different points. That's unlikely to come from FDA, right? Because again, they take a very firm stance that they don't regulate medical practice. So it's unlikely that FDA is going to say only psychiatrists can deliver these treatments. It could be a manufacturer choice, either within a REMS or outside the REMS. And that decision is likely to vary across different manufacturers. I don't know of any yet that are saying that they will necessarily restrict. There's some considerations there around equitable access, because in some parts of the country, Aaron, you can attest to this, there aren't a whole lot of psychiatrists out there. And so, how would those patients be served? So it's an important question that I think hasn't been ironed out yet. But
I think, Steve, the model with Spravato and also I think my prediction is that it's going to be limited to psychiatrists initially because there's great pressure on the recipients of the approval from the FDA, and they want to be very selective at first. Usually, the impetus for a new drug is get as much market share as you can, get tons of people to buy it. We saw with Spravato was very surprising. They were very selective about. They said off the bat, no anesthesiology run clinics. They didn't even want to do really ketamine clinics because they have that. So they were more worried about nothing bad happening, certifying each clinic, certifying each provider, only psychiatrists. And I think that's the way it's going to be, and then it'll open up. And then at the other level, the insurance companies add their own, and we see this with TMS. At the beginning, a lot of people wanted to do TMS that weren't psychiatrists, and when insurance companies adopted policies for it, they said it has to be a board-certified psychiatrist trained in this. So I think we're going to see one of the things that's going to happen is I think we're going to see a lot of the fly-by-night people who kind of came into this without a passion and history for mental illness because it was a good business model. They're gonna be kind of pushed out, as they are being pushed out because Spravato is growing, and they can't anesthesiologists really can't do it, or emergency room physicians can't do Spravato.
Great points. Thanks, David.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Steve. We should thank all
Thank you.
our speakers.
We're meeting in the next room for dinner.
Which I think is a great sort of, is it God, is it Mammon? I don't know what it is.
Good Friday, you want to be in the chapel.
Exeter College drinks are in the chapel. Pre-dinner drinks are in the chapel of Exeter College, and then we'll move to the dining hall. Thank you. Look forward to seeing you then.